So we are welcoming back our co-host, Chad Page, sheep and goat specialist for Utah State University. And today he's going to visit about body condition and nutritional needs in a seasonal capacity with our sheep and goats and sort of bring around some of the discussion that we just had about grazing management. And so welcome, and I will let you take off with this topic. Thanks, Chad.
Okay. Thank you, Linda. So I guess the reason I had been thinking about this topic, and one of the reasons that we reached out to Eric, is just the somewhat extreme winter that a lot of us had and the effects that it had on, one, our management, and then two, our animals. And so thinking about what we can do to, Eric did a really good job describing on what we could do to, change our rangeland, or how we should treat it, after these big drought events or things like that. I've been thinking of, well, can we do now to maybe manage our animals a little bit differently, or at least start assessing where we're at. So I asked a producer for some pictures of this winter to try to give us an idea of, how tough this winter was on a lot of people through, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, Montana. There's been a lot of snowfall, but I know that the entirety of the US has had some pretty extreme weather this year. And so that has forced us to have to change some management decisions. Maybe it has just made the animals lose some body condition, maybe lose some weight as we are going through our breeding season, and then through gestation as we're coming up to lambing for a lot of our producers. Or maybe we've already started dropping lambs, and now we're thinking about how things are going to go. But I think these pictures point out pretty clearly the extent of the cover that the snow had. This picture, being in Wyoming, here's another one here that kind of shows the amount of snow coverage over some of those plants that Eric was talking about that do provide so much nutrition. And when you think of some of those most valuable plants out on rangeland, things like salt sage, they don't grow quite as tall as some of the others. And so enabling your sheep or your goats that are maybe out on range to get some of those plants can be difficult. So one thing that I've been thinking about, and one reason that as we as producers on maybe more extensive operations try to lamb the time we do, one, our animals are seasonal polyestrous, so they breed, they're short day breeders, but also a lot of our management decisions, and when we turn in our rams or our bucks for the first time, generally we're calculating out to when those kids and lambs are going to drop. And oftentimes we try to match our nutrition requirements with our forage availability. Okay. And so depending on what plant species you have, and Eric would probably be better suited at talking about this than me, but here's a kind of a rough graph of showing the cool season and warm season grass growth curves. Now, depending on the species you have, these growth curves could be different. Maybe your operation where you're at is majority warm season grasses, or maybe it's the majority of cool season grasses. And so to try to eliminate that one big cost that all of us have in feeding, generally we try to match up our nutrition requirements with those growth curves, right? Maybe some operations don't. So if we're showing lambs, oftentimes we're lambing and kidding in January, so that the objective of our operation is to have larger lambs when we go to market those lambs, and then ultimately for the fair, for the show. But if you can see here in this graph, I kind of have the energy requirements of a 154 pound ewe, so moderate sized ewe, through different production cycles, right? And so we have maintenance, breeding, early gestation. You kind of see the difference between the two. One being raising twins has a greater requirements overall during gestation and lactation. But those highest requirements are going to be in early lactation and peak lactation. So oftentimes we either try to have turnout around that time. But this year, often, we because of the winter we had, we might want to assess a little bit differently where our animals are at and if we need to do any additional management in order to get them where they need to be. So one very easy and economic tool that I think we do use as producers, but we could use even more, is body condition scoring. And I'm a huge fan of this, right? When we're talking about maintenance of an animal or the nutritional requirements of an animal, there are some things that come to a highest priority versus the lowest priority. And so maintenance comes number one, maintaining that animal, right? The growth of that animal, and then ultimately goes into those things like lactation or fetal growth, maintaining pregnancy, breeding up, and then ultimately putting on body reserves, right? So what is body condition scoring? It's essentially us measuring those reserves, that body fat reserve, on our sheep or goats during various stages of production. Okay, this aids us in management decisions, formulating rations or making feeding decisions, or where we may want to bring them to different areas out on range, or maybe a different pasture if we have one pasture that's higher quality than another. Doing simple body condition scoring can be an effective tool in allowing us to change some of those things that we need to. Kind of going back to that highest priority versus lowest priority, this is kind of one of those reasons that I like to tell my students that reproduction really is something that is, what is the word? So reproduction is something that doesn't come lightly, right? It's after everything is met and those requirements are met, reproduction comes last. And so oftentimes we talk about this in the cattle industry, but it works the same with our sheep and goat operations. So how do we body condition score? Jokingly, I throw this picture up of this ram, right, that was let go. I believe this was Chris the sheep or Shrek, one of those sheep, and it kind of gets the point across. It's meant to be funny, but ultimately with our sheep, when they have a larger fleece on them, it is harder for us to determine what kind of body condition scoring they have, right? And so how do we go about doing that? What do we need to do? And ultimately, we need to get our hands on these animals. And so every time we get the opportunity, and it's a little bit harder in some of our more extensive operations where maybe we don't have as many opportunities to get hands on our animals, but when we do, we should take advantage of it, right? And so what we want to do is feel through that wool and palpate across that spinous process and the transverse process just behind the last ribs. And that gives us a good idea of how much flesh is on that animal. I put a link here to a pretty good diagram that our collaborators, Dr. Kelly Froelich and Jaylyn Whaley from South Dakota State University have put out. And unfortunately, this is set to the back, but it shows a diagram of kind of what these animals would look like. And I'll show another picture of these in just a second to go back to them. But in the diagram, we generally score with sheep and goats a 1 to a 5, 1 being extremely emaciated, 5 being very obese and fat. And there are different times in our production systems where our animals should be, or it's more appropriate for them to be at different body condition scores. Okay, so this is a natural thing, right? This body condition score will change with time and throughout the year, especially as we're making our animals essentially work for us and making us money. So it's a normal thing. Knowing the production of your ewes will allow you to anticipate the different nutritional needs and prepare to bring those ewes back to an ideal body condition score. So I kind of scoured a bunch of different literature and looked at a lot of different recommendations on where animals should be and different body condition scores and some different literature. And ultimately, it kind of goes back to a graph similar to this one, where it gives you your stage of production, whether they're dry, so this would be a true maintenance period for sheep. Then you go into breeding, early gestation, and all the way through gestation into lactation, and then ultimately weaning. And through that time, we should probably increase our body condition score, and we'll talk about this in just a second with breeding. And then going right before lambing or kidding, we want to make sure that our body condition score is adequate. So in this example, it gives a 3.5 is our ideal body condition score going into lambing and kidding, because right after that, like we'd shown in earlier slides, we see that highest demand nutritionally will be the time during lactation. Early lactation and peak lactation are those most demanding times. And so we need to make sure that our body condition scores are high enough going into that, so that when those animals do start pulling reserves in order to feed those lambs and produce milk to the volume that they need to, that they can do so adequately without their own maintenance suffering much, right? Another thing to think about is in late gestation, one thing that is common with sheep and goats is a pregnancy toxemia, right? Sometimes we call this ketosis, or we call this twin lamb disease, but ultimately it's that inability for that ewe to have enough blood glucose in her system to maintain herself, because at that time in late gestation, that blood glucose will be shunted to the lambs and given to the lambs. Okay, looks like my laptop, I'm out at the farm today, so my laptop's telling me it's pretty low, but we'll get through this. So here's a good body condition score. So it's about 12 to 14% of the mature weight of your animals that will change a body condition score, essentially one score up or down. Okay, so for example, say your ewes are generally 175 pounds in a maintenance requirement, or maintenance weight. Now, if you had ewes that normally sat at that were a body condition score 2, they're probably a little bit closer to 150 pounds at that time, right? But there are a lot of different things that affect this that we should keep into consideration with our ewes. So what kind of growth are they? Are they yearlings? Are they still developing? Are they ewe lambs that we've been trying to breed? Lactation, how prolific are they as far as lactation, or our dairy goats? This is something that we want to think about with our dairy goats. And then how many lambs or kids are they dropping? Are we expecting as producers for them to take care of? Some environmental factors that would affect our lambs and our ewes would be, how tough is the terrain that we're asking them to work in? Putting that reminder picture at the bottom of those ewes having to work out in the deep snow this winter, those increase our requirements, nutritional requirements. Heat and cold stress is a thing with sheep. It's that thermal neutral zone that we often talk about with cattle or goats. It's a little bit wider, especially with a full fleece on a sheep. But a minimum temperature for a freshly shorn sheep, maintenance level is around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. About 40% additional energy above maintenance may be needed for lower temperatures around 0. And then if wind is even greater, if we have really strong winds, that could even limit some of the effectiveness of a full fleece. And so these are all things that we should keep in mind when we're thinking how much our animals need. So here's some other things to think about as we're looking at ideal body condition scores. With males, our rams and our bucks, they really have one job. Most of the year, we could maybe maintain them at a little bit lower body condition score because they're not working oftentimes as hard as our ewes are. But when it is time to work, 4 weeks prior, we should start making sure that we can push them up into a body condition score of roughly a 3 or a 3.5, and knowing that they'll probably lose a whole body condition score, roughly 15% of their weight, going into the breeding season and throughout the breeding season. So if they're going in at a lower body condition score of a 2.5, they may not have enough energy stores to make it through that season as successfully. And a lot of research has shown that emaciated rams are much more likely to have subpar semen parameters, mainly around motility and morphology. So they wouldn't be able to cover as many ewes. Think about our females and body condition scores. If we do have some ewes in a lower body condition score, and around breeding, we push them up into a higher body condition score, say we're going from a 2.5 to a 3.5, that actually elicits a little bit stronger of a flushing response in our ewes than if they were already at a higher body condition score. However, there is still an effect even when you're thinking about just increasing nutritional plane overall. So if you are already have your ewes or your does at a higher body condition score, you still will see some kind of flushing response. Just not quite as strong. Ideally, your ewes should be above a body condition score of a 3 before being exposed to rams. And then as you move into late gestation, when we start thinking about pregnancy toxemia, or we start thinking about lactation that's right around the corner, we want to make sure they're actually a little bit higher than a 3. Look at something closer to a 3.5, maybe even pushing up to a 4. So why, should we consider body condition scores? And this is kind of, this talk that I'm giving isn't meant to be super scientific. It's more kind of quick and dirty. Are we assessing where our animals are at right now after the type of winter that we've had? If we need to change some things to get them to where they should be before as lambs are dropping, and if so, we probably might need to supplement a little more if they are lower body condition score, or maybe because we've been feeding them throughout this winter, they already are at an adequate body condition score. And these can help us hopefully save money in the long run by not giving as much food if we don't need to, if they are at an effective body condition score. But ultimately, this is just a very cost-effective way of making some management decisions, and it just really requires your time, your attention, and also some note taking. So here's kind of an example of an assignment that I kind of run through with a lot of my students. I make them go through and essentially make a bar graph or a histogram on body condition scores with our sheep here at USU, and kind of looking at where they were right after shearing and late gestation. And you can see that not all of our ewes were right at that 3.5 body condition score where we want them, but a lot of them tended to be that way, maybe with some on the lower end and some a little bit on the higher end. But this is a good way to kind of see where your average lies amongst your animals. And you don't have to do all your animals, right? If you have a larger operation and you want to do randomly a couple alleyways full, this still gives you a good idea of where you're at and what you could do different, or just keep doing, just assure yourself that you're doing things right. So with that, I hope this was helpful. If anything, just a good reminder to all of us to continually assess where our animals are, depending on whatever curveball is thrown our way year to year. So with that, if anyone has questions, I'll go ahead and try to take those. I know, Melinda, if you saw my battery thing pop up on my screen while I was presenting, but my computer.
I don't think it came through on our end, but
okay.
We'll keep it somewhat brief for you.
Okay.
And we'll understand if you disappear, what happened.
Okay, thank you.
So reminder to everyone, if you have questions, to go ahead and pop them in the Q&A box. We do have a question right off the bat, which is someone who's experiencing an unusual large number of lambs in their lambing season this year, but not having done anything differently. Could this be attributed to a better overall body condition score, or do you think there were some other factors also?
I mean, I'm not, I mean, that's hard to say if you're saying nothing has changed, right? We think of, genetics or nutrition. If we're thinking of, maybe your animals did get a little bit better nutrition this last year before your breeding season, before other years. But it's hard to say without knowing exactly, your operation and what kind of animals you're using and things like that. But like some of that research says that, if they do go up on a little bit better plane of nutrition, you can expect a greater flushing response. And actually those and does will actually ovulate more eggs, and that actually can increase your lamb crop. So as far as it pertains to this talk, maybe, but I don't know for sure. So
Yeah, I think one of the things to keep in mind with that is also that without actually testing the nutritional value of your hay and your feed, that you really don't have a super good understanding of the nutritional value. So for example, if you're feeding your same hay that you usually feed, this year's crop could have been a little more nutritious, or the batch that you got right before flushing could have been better. So that's something that contribute, as well as if the weather is a little nicer during breeding, or there's a number of factors that I think can play into that.